Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I'm here today at the Royal Armouries, the National Firearms Centre in Leeds, England, and I'm here today courtesy of ARES, Armament Research Services. Today we are taking a look at a pair of British EM2 rifles. Now this rifle was actually adopted very briefly in 1951 as Rifle No. 9 Mark I by the British military, and then subsequently unadopted in 1952 for largely political reasons, and we'll get into that story in just a moment. What I'd like to start with, though, is the basic overview of this rifle. This really was a gun that was well ahead of its time. It was the first militarily significant bullpup rifle. It was a rifle designed for an intermediate style of cartridge. It was a rifle that had only limited backup iron sights and was equipped primarily with an optical sight, which was a fairly novel concept in the 1940s when this was designed. The Germans had expressed an interest in doing that, but were never able to actually fulfill it. The British came very close to actually implementing that whole concept. The lead engineer on this project was a Polish immigrant to the UK by the name of Stefan Januszewski, I think. He had the practical sense after being naturalized as a UK subject in 1947 to anglicize his name and became known as Jansen, which is how I will refer to him henceforth because my Polish pronunciation is not good. So this became known as the EM2 or the Jansen rifle. Development began in 1947, although Jansen did actually have a significant role in development of the EM1 Corsac rifle, which was largely a copy of the FG42 in bullpup form. I have a separate video on that rifle, which you should check out if you haven't seen it yet. So a lot of the work that went into that rifle, while that gun was not particularly practical, it set a lot of the groundwork for guns like the EM2 that would follow afterwards. So that rifle development began in 45, with Jansen playing a role. In 47, it was scrapped, and because it wasn't showing serious promise, and development instead turned to the EM1 by an Englishman named Thorpe, and the EM2 here by Jansen. Mechanically, this is basically a copy of the German G43 system. It is a flapper-locked action. We'll pull one of these apart here in just a moment, but it's interesting that a bunch of these British post-war development rifles were in fact copied from German mechanisms. In fact, all three of the EM series rifles are this way. The Corsac EM1 was a copy of the FG42. The Thorpe EM1 was largely a copy of the Garate 06H, or the Garate 06, and then the Jansen EM2 here was largely a copy of the G43. These systems worked. Why not? Everyone recognized that the Germans had had a pretty substantial small arms development program during the war, and everyone was quite happy to take advantage of standing on those shoulders. Now, in terms of cartridge, the British had properly taken the lesson from World War II that infantry combat wasn't taking place at extended ranges. The existing cartridges, the .303 British in British service, the .30-06 in American service, which would become very relevant, we'll get to that. These were cartridges designed to be effective out to 600 or 800 yards, if not farther. But combat didn't ever take place at those distances. Honestly, with an iron-sighted rifle, you can't even identify a target at anything close to those ranges. Instead, combat was actually taking place at 300 to 400 yards. And the British recognized that and developed an intermediate cartridge to reduce the amount of impact on the guns, reduce the weight of the ammunition, reduce the recoil, make the guns more shootable, more controllable. In pretty much every way, you kind of want the lightest cartridge that will effectively do the job, because it makes everything else in the problem simpler. And the cartridge that was designed for this rifle was the .280 British. This was a .280 caliber, a 7mm bullet. It started as a 130 grain bullet traveling at about 2,400 feet per second. That was later bumped up slightly to a 140 grain bullet traveling at 2,530 feet per second. This is a little bit more powerful of a round than something like the German 8mm Kurz, but it's still substantially less powerful than the .30-06 or the .303 British, and that was the idea. Now they had a 20-round magazine of these cartridges in this rifle. And remember, this would have been replacing the .303 Lee Enfield, the No. 4 Lee Enfield rifle. And this was a massive technological advancement over a bolt-action Lee-Enfield. This allowed a far higher rate of fire for the infantry, faster reloading, faster follow-up shots, more accurate. This was really a pretty excellent rifle in 1947. In total, 55 of these would be built, 5 of them being prototypes, and then 50 production guns. The first of those production guns were a series of 20 manufactured primarily by Enfield. The first 3 were done by a contractor in Hammersmith, and then the remaining 17 done by the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. And these were put together in 1948. They were tested in the UK and did pretty well. This all was building up to a 1950 trial at Aberdeen Proving Grounds in the United States. So in the aftermath of World War II, the Allies decided that they really ought to standardize on an infantry rifle. There had obviously been logistical problems during World War II where, if the British needed small arms ammunition, well, the US didn't have .303 to give them. The French didn't have .303 to give them. Everyone had their own rifle and their own ammunition, and none of it was interchangeable. Well, we're putting together NATO. If we're going to fight another world war as a group of allies, it makes a lot of logistical sense for people to have standardized equipment. So in Aberdeen in 1950, there was the first trial held with the idea of adopting both a standard cartridge and a standard rifle. This trial had 3 competitors entered. From the US, it had the T-25 rifle, designed by Earl Harvey. I don't have a video on that, but I do have a written blog post on it if you'd like to know more about that rifle. Honestly, it wasn't very successful. It had a lot of problems. It was, however, chambered for what would become the .308 NATO cartridge, the T-65 cartridge. It was the developmental version of this round, which was ballistically pretty much the same as .30-06, but with a slightly shorter case so that the rifles could be made a bit shorter. In competition to that, the British brought the EM2 in .280, and the Belgians brought an early version of the FN-FAL, also in .280. And honestly, all 3 rifles kind of had some trouble at this initial trial. The EM2 had some parts breakage issues. It also was disappointingly inaccurate, although it appears that the batch of ammunition that was brought to this trial was kind of suspect. When they chronographed it, when they did an ammunition trial at the same time, the muzzle velocity on the .280 British ammo at this trial was several hundred feet per second slower than what the spec was. It was at like 2,270 feet per second instead of 2,450, and it had serious accuracy problems. That doesn't appear to have been the fault of the rifle. It appears to have been the ammo, but 75 years later, it's a bit hard to tell for sure. The FAL had some accuracy issues. The American T-25 was kind of a train wreck of a rifle. It didn't go well. In fact, Harvey didn't even realize that this was going to be a serious trial. He was under the impression that this was basically just kind of a preliminary inspection, and he would be home that evening on the evening train, which was not the case. At any rate, the outcome of this trial was pretty much the U.S. came to the conclusion that they were not willing to accept an intermediate cartridge. They thought that the ballistic power of .30-06 or the new T-65, which would become 7.62 NATO, they thought that was critically important. They didn't want to give up effective range. Part of this may have had to do with wanting to continue to use that same cartridge in medium and emplaced machine guns, where that ballistic capability is a bit more important. At any rate, in 1952, the U.S. finally just came out and flat out said, we will not accept anything less than a .30 caliber cartridge. That is why the EM2 was unadopted. Now, in the aftermath of this trial, a couple things were done. The British and the Canadians and the Belgians all together decided that they'd have to try and accommodate the U.S. desire for a more powerful cartridge, and so they looked into some cartridge development. They started making this .280 cartridge progressively closer to .308 NATO. They increased the velocity, they increased the bullet weight, they made the case longer, and it got closer and closer, but it was never something that the American Ordnance Department was willing to accept. In April of 1951, the British Defense Minister, a guy named Emanuel Shinwell, came out and publicly stated that the British military would be adopting this rifle as Rifle Number 9 Mark I because it really was, in the British eyes, and objectively at that point, the best option available. And they thought that the rest of NATO would go along with them. However, this didn't happen. It was shortly after this that the U.S. came out and publicly said they wouldn't accept anything less than .30 caliber. At that point, Winston Churchill had been reelected as Prime Minister, and in the interests of maintaining a good relationship with NATO, he unadopted this rifle. They said, okay, we won't go with that, we will go with the American cartridge. What happened at that point was the British and the Belgians decided to accept the FN FAL in 308, or in 762 NATO, as the standard rifle. And they were under the impression that if they made that compromise and accepted the American cartridge, the American military would also make a compromise and accept the FN FAL as its issue rifle. Now this is getting into a whole nother story, but American ordnance was not willing to accept the FAL and would continue trials and eventually adopt the M14 instead, rather to the disgust of the European militaries that had, they thought, been bargaining in good faith. At any rate, what we're looking at today is not the FAL and not the M14, but the EM2. So let's take a closer look at this, some of its features, and then take it apart. One thing I want to start with is that this rifle has, aside from the fact that it is a bullpup, absolutely no similarity or connection to the later British SA-80 or L-85 bullpups. Those are mechanically completely different guns. However, the British government or military was interested in this bullpup concept, and their interest stayed over several decades. Hence, we have the EM2 as a bullpup and also the L-85 as a bullpup. But there is no developmental continuity between these two projects. Now, with that said, this rifle was designed only to be fired from the right shoulder. There were some theoretical plans to make left-handed versions, but that never actually materialized. It's a 20-round magazine in the back. The magazine is a bit complex. It does have some features. This one's a little sticky at the moment. Let's see if I can. Well, it has a stripper clip guide built into the back of the magazine. This one only wants to come up halfway, but you get the idea. You can actually pull this up, it snaps over, and then you can load the magazine from stripper clips without needing a separate tool. When the magazine is empty, the rifle will lock open, like so. And normally, with a magazine-fed rifle, I can take the magazine out, and then if I want to close the bolt, I just pull the charging handle. On the EM2, that does nothing, because this is designed to have a loaded magazine. When you insert a loaded magazine, it automatically trips the bolt release, closes the bolt, chambers the first round, and presents you with a rifle ready to fire. Now, should you want to close the bolt without having a loaded magazine, you can do that. You actually take the magazine release and you push it backwards, like that. And as long as there's no magazine in the gun, that will close the bolt. So it's actually a pretty slick system. It's a little bit complicated, but not as bad as you might expect. Now, there is also a dust cover here. That snaps shut, prevents ingress of gunk into the bolt. There is also an open slot here for the charging handle, although you'll notice that when the charging handle is closed, the gas piston takes up this slot. Overall, this is a pretty well sealed up gun. The safety is located here in the front of the trigger guard, very much like the M1 Garand. That's safe, that's ready to fire. It's an ambidextrous system, although that doesn't really matter on a rifle that can only be shot right-handed. But it's also a system that makes it very evident to the shooter when the safety is on. And it's actually an easier safety to disengage than the M1, which is kind of nice. We have a button here on the side. This is a push-through button, and that is the fire selector. So you can see it is marked R on that side for repetition or semi-auto. And then if you push it through, on the other side, it's marked A for automatic. So that's full auto. And that's your fire selector. Now with, like the L-85 that would come much later, this has two separated controls, one for safe and fire, and one for single shot and fully automatic. One of the other really cool elements to the EM2 was that it was intended to be used primarily with an optical sight for everybody who is issued the gun. This conical thing here is actually a shield over the optic. It is what was called a unit optic. It is a 1 power, so non-magnifying optic, and it has a little crosshair or a little pointer in it that was zeroed for 200 yards with then two holdover notches or lines for 400 and 600 yards. Actually, I think it would have been meters, but close enough to being the same, honestly. There is then a backup iron sight mounted on the rear sight bracket here, and a folding backup front sight there on the gas block. So you did have emergency iron sights if necessary, but this was intended to be used primarily with the optical sight. You can see the back of the optic there. It's a really, really tiny lens. It's like a 4 or 5 millimeter lens, even smaller than the German ZF-41. But it was intended to be light and simple, and that shield around it made it pretty durable. There's the front end. This, I suspect, would have been pretty quickly improved and modified if the rifle had gone into service. Although what's interesting is they did take this optic and carry it over to the early British FAL rifles. The first ones, they did experiment with this exact same optic. All right, there is the reticle system. I've got that close to in focus. You would see the same system basically used on the Trilux optic for, many, many decades later. All right, then we have our emergency front sight there, rear sight here, which gives you just a simple aperture sight picture like that. Of course, it is intended to be used with the optic. So the standard rifle was about 3.5 kilograms, which is just a little under 8 pounds, and had a 24.5-inch barrel, which is quite a remarkably long barrel. Remember, this is a bullpup, so the barrel ends here and starts all the way back there. They did also have plans to consider a paratrooper version, a carbine version, and we have one of those examples here. This is a magnificently handy little rifle. It's about 5 inches shorter. I don't have an exact measurement on the barrel, but the handguards are almost the same length. The barrel here comes to right about this point on the standard rifle. So they made a couple prototypes of these. It's interesting to note that while they were doing this, they were also looking at other potential issues. You can see that a little shield has been added here. This would have been blocking the magazine catch from the shooter's body, so they might have had some issues with people accidentally tripping the mag catch. I don't know if it's just age and wear, but the mag catch springs on these two rifles are both fairly light. It doesn't take a lot of pressure to drop the magazine. And this may have been just an experiment to try and prevent that from becoming a problem. So disassembly, we're going to start by taking out the magazine. I do want to comment, this is so magnificently simple compared to the EM1, and honestly, it's a pretty simple and effective field stripping system by any standards even today. So the first step is going to be to remove the butt plate. On the butt plate, we have this spring-loaded button. I push that in and rotate the butt plate, and then it's going to come out with its recoil spring and guide. Next, I'm going to pull the charging handle all the way back. At this point, the charging handle slot is enlarged and the handle can come out. The gun has been dry fired, so I do need to cock it in the process. So this is going to be a little bit of a stiff pull. There we go. That comes to there. I can pull the charging handle out. And then at the back of the gun, I have access to the bolt and the operating rod. And those come right out, and then the bolt drops off of the op rod. One more step to basic disassembly is to remove the fire control group. We're going to do that by removing this one pin. So I push that pin through, pull it out. Captive pin stays in there, and then the back of the grip comes up and the whole thing comes out. There we have a completely field stripped EM2 Para. This is, like I said, a really simple, slick system. Mechanically speaking, this rifle works virtually exactly like the German G43. So we have a pair of flaps in the bolt here. They're currently retracted, which is unlocked and allows the bolt to cycle. The operating rod has this round peg that locks into the bolt here, and when it goes into battery, there we go, this is going to push forward, and a plug inside the bolt spreads these two flaps outward. Here they would be locked into the receiver or into the trunnion. That solidly locks the bolt, and then to fire it, you press up on this little lever right at the front of the bolt. Now the way the rifle is set up, when the bolt is in battery, it's going to be sitting right about here. The trigger mechanism sits right there, and so you can see that these two line up like this. When I pull the trigger, we have this blade at the back of the mechanism that lifts up. That is directly in line with that trip on the bottom of the bolt. And when I push that in, It's got a quite stiff spring in it. And it fires, and the firing pin protrudes through. To recock the action, all you have to do is pull this internal block backwards, which is done by the operating rod, which sits there. And when the rifle cycles, the operating rod comes back. You can see it clicks into place. The two flaps retract into the bolt. The firing pin is recocked. The empty case is then ejected and a new case loaded from the magazine. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was really cool to get a chance to take a look at not just the standard one, but also one of the kind of the prototype short paratrooper versions of the EM2. This thing is one of the coolest guns I think I've ever run across. It's just got all sorts of, it's so cool. At any rate, if you would like to see more about these guns, there are a couple things that you can do. One is to check out the Armament Research Services blog. They will be posting high-res pictures of these guns as the video goes up, and you can see a link to that in the description text below. And of course, you could come here to the National Firearms Center in Leeds and take a look at these guns yourself. They have actually a substantial number of these. A dozen or 15 of them, I believe, of several different calibers, experimental versions, all sorts of cool stuff. The collection here is not open to the general public, but it is available by appointment. So if you are doing particular research on these guns or anything else that the NFC has in its collection, by all means contact them, set up an appointment, and come take a look at the collection. Thanks for watching.